All right, well, good afternoon. My name is Sal Mercogliano. I'm an associate professor of history at Campbell University, which is located in North Carolina, about half an hour south of Raleigh, home of the Fighting Camels. No better place for a maritime historian to reside than a place with a camel as their mascot. I'm here today, and first of all, I want to thank Dr. Berbe and the museum for inviting me to give the opening of this year's Shiftly Lectures. It's a great honor and privilege to be here at the museum. I'm going to talk about today is the topic of Sealift and how it involves and kind of impacts American military sea strategy. This is a topic that you may not be very familiar with. A little bit on my background, I was a merchant mariner. I sailed ships for 3 years and then worked ashore for 4 years for an organization called the Military Sealift Command. We'll be talking about a bit here. I did my undergrad at the State University of New York Maritime College. I did my master's at East Carolina in nautical archaeology and maritime history, and my PhD in military naval history at Alabama.
Roll Tide.
There you go, Roll Tide. And before I went to Alabama, the universities at SUNY and East Carolina, I was a privateer and a pirate. So no better place for a privateer and a pirate to be than on the campus of the Naval Academy. So I think it's very appropriate for me to be here today. The images I have for you here talk about Sealift in different ways. The image in the upper left there is the USS Leviathan, which was the largest ship in the US Navy until the commissioning of USS Midway in 1945. She was an intern German liner, the Vaterland, that was turned into a troop ship during World War I, being escorted by an American four-stack destroyer. Down in this lower left is a World War II convoy, just typical of what you'll see in World War II convoying across the Atlantic and the Pacific. And the image in the lower right there was taken 3 weeks ago, about 100 miles from here off of the Delaware, Maryland coast during a turbo activation of 33 surge ships in the reserve fleet. And so what I'm going to talk about to you today is 4 topics or 4 aspects of maritime sea lift. I'm going to talk about the Combat Logistics Force. I'm going to talk about prepositioning, a float prepositioning. I'm going to talk about the surge sea lift force and talk a little bit about sustainment. How do we sustain our fleet and our military overseas in both peacetime and at war? This is an image that's probably pretty familiar to many of you. I'm going to show this poster is up on a few walls around campus. This is done by Raytheon. This is the ships and submarines of the US Navy. This is the 2018 version of that. And it features, as it says, ships and submarines. So you've got aircraft carriers, you've got your surface combatants, you've got your submarines, you've got your amphibs, you got your mine warfare, you got your patrol boats, and at the very bottom right there, you have 2 auxiliary ships and 1 ship that's held by the North Koreans for some strange reason. We still list the Pueblo on the official list, but 2 subtenders. Yet if you look at the official numbers for the US Navy, of the 290 ships in the battle fleet, there's a large number missing from here, and that's the 60 combat logistics and support ships. 2 of them are on there, the 2 subtenders are on there, but the other 58 are not on there. And the question is, why not? And those 60 ships are manned and crewed by civilian mariners, mariners from the Merchant Marine. 1 out of 5 ships in the US Navy have civilian crews on board. Every auxiliary has a civilian crew member on board. Even though some of them, like the subtenders, are commanded by Navy 06s, he still has civilian merchant mariners on his deck force and his engineering force. And this 20% doesn't change if you go to the 355 ship Navy, for example. Still roughly that same percentage is going to take place. So every auxiliary has become manned by civilian mariners. And that's a substantial number. And every other branch or every other aspect of the Navy has at its command one of its members. You know, carriers are commanded by aviators, some commanded by submariners. SEALs tend to command SEALs. Yet, in the case of auxiliaries, here you have merchant mariners who are operating a good chunk of the fleet and don't have a large presence in a variety of different commands. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So what are these 60 ships? What are these 60 ships? This is the similar sheet done by the Military Sealift Command. These are the ships of the Military Sealift Command. This is the fleet that's done. Roughly about 110 ships are commanded by a Navy 2-star. And the Military Sealift Command, which has been in existence since 1949 in a different name, has been around for a long time. A big chunk of those 60 ships are right here, 29 Combat Logistics Force ships. Oilers, supply ships, AOEs, they represent the direct supply to the Navy. If you're out on a Navy vessel, whether it's a carrier, surface combatant, amphib, when that ship pulls alongside for refueling, it's going to be a civilian manned replenishment vessel. And that is not a new thing in the history of the U.S. Navy. It's been around a long time, as we'll talk about. The other vessels that make up that 60 vessels are spread across here. They're in a different, many different guises. There are sonar surveillance vessels that stream SOSUS rigs. There are expeditionary support bases and expeditionary support docks. There are fast transports. There's a myriad of different vessels. What's not included in the list, what's not included in the 60 vessels, are ships from the prepositioning fleet, survey vessels, a very large fleet, a very large fleet. I'll almost make the argument that the commander of MSC commands the largest fleet in the U.S. Navy. He has more vessels under his operational command and oversight than any of the fleet commanders. And how did this come about? Why does this exist? And I can't go into detail about all these vessels, so I'm going to pick one group, and that is the Navy Oilers. That is the 15 ships that make up the underway replenishment. In 1986, the very first of these, what's called second-generation Oilers, came out, the Henry J. Kaiser. There are 15 of these. It was a class of 18 ships. 2 of them were never completed. 1 has since been sold to Chile, but the other 15 are in service today. They are probably the best logistics vessels in the world when it comes to delivering fuel. 15 of them located around the world, forward deployed. 7 of them are out in Europe and Asia. 8 of them are CONUS-based, 5 on the East Coast, 3 on the West Coast, which is actually a little bit low compared. They usually have more forward deployed. There's an AOE right now out in the Persian Gulf, which is covering part of this, and a batch of the ships just entered yard periods. But you'll see where they're located right there. These ships represent the second generation, and they're about to be phased out. They're about to be phased out. They carry anywhere between 150 and 180,000 barrels of fuel. They have 5 underway replenishment rigs, 3 to port, 2 to starboard. They can handle replenishing carriers and surface combatants at the same time. This is the job I used to have. I was a third mate on these vessels, and a second mate on the last ship I was on was navigator of a sister ship of that one right there, the John Lenthal. And they're about to be replaced. They're about to be phased out. NASSCO, the shipyard out in San Diego, has just cut steel on the newest generation, the John Lewis, TAO 205. We're going to see them coming out. These represent the third generation of civilian manned oilers entering the fleet. And you may be asking yourself, well, wait a minute, why are civilians manning Navy vessels? Why do we have merchant mariners manning this? Why are these not manned by naval officers? Why? Because it had been. If you go up until the 1990s, many auxiliaries had naval crews on board. The new generation, the John Lewises, are basically amped up Kaiser-class oilers. I actually think they're not the most imaginative change in design. I would have gone with something a little different. But they're going to represent basically the next evolution in this. If you take a step back in history from the Kaisers, the very first oilers you see are right during the Vietnam War. In 1972, a U.S. Navy oiler, the Toluga, USS Toluga, was turned over to a civilian crew, the USNS Toluga. She was a modified T3 tanker. These were commercial vessels built during World War II. The T3s were very unique because they were built both for the military and civilian. They had twin screws, high power, and more importantly, carried quite a lot of fuel on board. And these ships served as both supply tankers. In other words, they took fuel from oil refineries, brought them out to forward bases, or they would replenish oilers underway so that they can provide direct support to the fleet. The decision was made during the Vietnam War. We were coming out of Vietnam. Decision is made to start reducing the size of the fleet. There are personnel issues. A U.S. Navy oiler was taking a crew of about 150 to 175. You can get away with crewing a civilian manned oiler with about half that number of people. You don't have the weapon systems on board. You don't have to worry about training the sailors because they come pre-trained because of their background. You're pulling them from the commercial fleet. And the question was, can you teach them how to do underway replenishment? And that was proved in 1972. Matter of fact, Teluga becomes the best oiler in Westpac in 1973. But this concept of civilian manning doesn't go back just to Vietnam. It actually goes back even further. It goes back to 1899. 1899, after the Spanish-American War, the U.S. found itself with a worldwide commitment. It had bases now in the Philippines, had bases in Guam, Hawaii, Cuba, and it needed to sustain the fleet worldwide. And one of the big problems was, how are we going to get the fuel to those bases, coal in particularly? And so in 1899, the Secretary of the Navy contracted with a civilian master to take and crew the ship, the USS Alexander. This is Alexander right here. Alexander becomes the first civilian manned collier, part of what was called the Navy Collier Service. Initially 5 vessels are in it, eventually it expands up to 18. And from 1899 to 1917, this service morphs into something called the Navy Auxiliary Service. There were envisionments of bringing other ships over to civilian manning. They're going to basically run this as a civilian entity. You can always tell these ships are civilian manned. It's hard to see in this image, but there's a little stack color right there, a little buff color stack. That's how you can always tell. And so all the fuel ships, those are the colliers and the oilers, come over to being civilian manned. And that goes until 1917, right until American entry in World War I. When America enters World War I, there's a decision made to militarize these vessels. While the officers were largely Navy reservists, the Navy Reserve program kicks off in 1916, and one of the things you see is all the commanders are lieutenant commanders in the U.S. Navy Auxiliary. The problem here is that many of the crews are actually foreigners. They're not of American descent. And so there's a big concern about having foreign crews on board. So in 1917, they purged the civilians off the vessels, and they basically militarize this, and they remove civilians from manning Navy auxiliaries. And that basically is the norm up and through World War II. But World War II is the turning point, because during World War II, the Navy is so hard pressed with personnel, it's got to make a decision of whether to put personnel on combatants or put them on auxiliary ships, that the Commander-in-Chief, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, decides to create a civilian agency called the Warshipping Administration, and the Warshipping Administration is going to run basically the logistics and the Sealift. After World War II, they decide to change this, and that's where you see kind of the modern derivation. This is the creation of what is known today as Military Sealift Command, but in 1949, October 1st, it was called Military Sea Transportation Service, MSTS. It's renamed during the Vietnam War in 1970. Its first commander is Admiral William Callahan. The name is familiar, and if he looks kind of familiar, his brother, Daniel Callahan, was the commander of the American task force that fought the Japanese off Guadalcanal on November 13th, 1942. It's the epic melee battle off of Savo Island in Guadalcanal. His brother loses his life on board the USS San Francisco, was awarded the Medal of Honor. Callahan himself is a very distinguished officer. He commands a variety of vessels, but more importantly, he's a logistics phenom. He just understands logistics, works for Admiral Nimitz in World War II. And so he's brought in to oversee this new agency that's going to bring together 3 entities. It's going to bring together the Army's commercial service, what's called the Army Transport Service, which uses largely these Victory ships in the upper left. It's going to bring over the Navy Transportation Service, which is what the Navy created during World War I and basically maintained it through World War II. Ships like the P-2 troop ship you see there at the bottom. And then it's going to bring in the Warshipping Administration, which is operating civilian tankers largely, like the T-2 tanker you see there in the upper right. So those tankers are going to come over to them. And from 1949 up and through, I would argue, the Vietnam War, we basically handled military sealift in a very kind of straightforward manner. Very much like we did it in Korea, in World War II, and World War I, we basically handled that. I wrote a booklet for the Navy History and Heritage Command on the role of Merchant Marine in Vietnam War, this book right here, Fourth Armored Defense, which you can download as a PDF. It's available on their webpage. So that is the Combat Logistics Force arm. This is where Teluga comes in. This is where Kaiser comes in. This is where the new John Lewis is going to come in. All of them are derived out of the Vietnam War. But those other three branches come out of this. This is from a Joint Chiefs of Staff publication. They came up with this idea back in the early 2000s, something called the Sealift Trident, where they talk about the three elements: prepositioning, surge, and sustainment. I was going to try to find a Sealift quadrant. It didn't work. I kept getting navigation tools or forks. So it didn't quite flow very well. So let me talk about each of these three aspects. Talk about prepositioning. So any wannabe Marines in here? Marines don't go to combat just riding on Navy amphibs. If you look at the way Marines go into combat, if you're going to put a full Marine force on the ground, a Marine Expeditionary Force on the ground, one of the things you're going to tap into is these maritime prepositioning squadrons. There are two of these out there in the world right now. One in Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Terrific place to go to. And the other is out based in the Marianas off of Guam. 7-ship squadrons. 7-ship squadrons. One of these ships, these are commercially manned vessels, one of these ships carries the entire complement of gear that an entire Marine amphibious group carries, minus the personnel and the aircraft. And these 7 ships, when they go in, can land all the equipment, all the gear, minus the personnel and the aircraft, for a 16,000-person Marine Expeditionary Brigade for 30 days of operations. For 30 days of operations. And there are 2 of these squadrons out there. One in Diego Garcia, one in Guam right now. And prepositioning is a novel idea. It has been around for a long time. If we get to go ahead today to go into the Persian Gulf, to go into Korea, go into Eastern Europe, one of the first groups you're going to see go in there are the maritime prepositioning ships. They have the ability to go pierside. You can offload the 7 ships in 3 days, or they can do it at anchor in 5 days. One of the things that has been changed from this group has evolved from 1980s, when it was just mainly a batch of ships loaded with rolling stock, to a more robust force in the 1980s, where there were 13 ships in 3 squadrons. They were instrumental in success in Persian Gulf, the first Persian Gulf War. The 7th Marine Expeditionary Brigade was the very first land combat force to hit the ground in Saudi Arabia in 1990. It did so by offloading the ships from Marine Prepositioning Squadron 2. We added ships to them after the Persian Gulf War. We increased the size of the squadron to 16 ships. We came up with an idea of maybe being able to project that force further from shore. So we added a sea basing element to it, what was called the MPF Future. So 2 of the vessels, the Montford Point and the Glen, actually have 3 LCACs on board. So it can actually deploy from over the horizon to do it. And so this is a very unique capability. And more importantly, these ships, besides dumping all the gear you need for 2 Marine brigades, then go into the common supply source and can start bringing in more gear for you. That represents the prepositioning element. There are elements of prepositioning that are changing right now. This ship right here, this is the Lewis B. Puller. She's an expeditionary support base. We're getting ready to see come in service the 3rd of these, a ship called the Miguel Keith. These ships are mobile support bases. They float around and provide a myriad of capabilities. They have special operators on them. They can support drones. They can support mine warfare. The idea being you don't need a fixed base. You can float these around. They're modified oil tankers, Alaska-class oil tankers. That's why they're the ugliest ships in the world. They really are. They're just horrendous looking. But they're massive platforms. That flight deck is about half the size of an LHD. It has an amazing capability on them. They're tremendous in size. And the problem is they're big. You can see where they are. Ships you can't see where they are is that one there on the right. That's the MV Ocean Trader. She's a modified German roll-on, roll-off ship. She's operated by Special Operations Command. Has no name on her. She rides dark in the AIS system. All ships squawk an AIS transponder. She doesn't. She's not even listed on any of those sheets I showed you. She is operated and modified to operate for Special Operations Command. A very clandestine expeditionary support base. Very novel kind of ship that you see operating out there. And that gives you an ability to preposition forces and combat tools out there. We talk about the surge shipping. surge shipping. There are 61 ships that are sitting there in the what we call the surge Sealift fleet, basically waiting for the call of action. They're waiting for something to happen and they can start loading gear and go. They could be loading Navy CB units, they load Marine gear, they'll load Army, they'll load Air Force equipment, and off they go. These are a direct result out of the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, one of the things we found out was the commercial merchant marine lacked sufficient ships, and more importantly, the sufficient type of ships that we wanted to be able to deploy forces overseas. So one of the things they feature are what are called roll-on, roll-off ships. Basically parking decks, floating parking decks. And what you can do is bring them in, drop their ramps, and just load them full of tanks, APCs, trucks, whatever you need, and off you go. There are 61 of these. They're based along the coast of the East, West, and Gulf Coast. They're a mix of ships owned by MSC, the Military Sealift Command, the Navy, and the Maritime Administration, the Ready Reserve Force. If you see a ship with a red, white, and blue stack, that's the RRF. If you see a gold and blue stack, that's MSC. 61 of the ships. The problem with this is these ships are getting old. The oldest of the ships is the Petersburg over there. She was built in 65. 65. You know, I was built in 67. I have a hard time getting off the couch some days. If you're sitting in reserve for a year and you got to sail it halfway around the world, that could be a big problem. And as a matter of fact, we found that out. Just past month, as I mentioned to you, they had a huge activation. 33 of these ships were activated. They were activated. And this was a test not just of the ships, but also to get the crews from them, because they pull their crews from the active merchant marine. They pull their crews, they have a small complement on board, about 9 to 10 people, but they need 30 to 40 to operate. And they're on a 4-day readiness. In other words, when you give the order on a Monday, they got to sail by Friday. And this happened in September. The order went out for initially 28, later 33 ships. And the test was a very important test. It was a stress test. They wanted to see exactly how well they responded. Of the 28 ships, for example, that were initially tested, 27 were able to get out on time. There were some issues with some ships having mechanical issues. One ship couldn't get underway because its data recorder, basically the black box, wasn't working. And then you had an issue of one ship down in Texas, Beaumont, couldn't get out and did not get out because Texas got a flood of water from a hurricane. And the ship was called the Regulus, couldn't get under the Martin Luther King Bridge because the river was flooded. There was a recent story in the Naval Institute about how climate change is affecting Annapolis. Well, this is an example of that right there. You couldn't activate the ship. They took the ships out, they stress tested them, they ran them at power runs, and one of the things is we're waiting to hear back on how well that did. How tough it was to find the crews, how well the vessels performed, we just don't know yet. This all came out of a series of reports and news the earlier part of the year. The commander of Transcom, General Lyons, who's an Army commander, he commands Military Sealift Command, he and Admiral Busby, who is the head of the Maritime Administration, went before Congress in March and said, this fleet is broken. They put up a chart just like this, and they showed that 13 of these ships are inoperable, can't get underway. And they've been working hard to get them out. Some of those vessels were tested recently. But they also cited the fact that we're short of mariners. In a long peer-to-peer confrontation, 6 months or so, that the enemy is fighting, we're going to come up about 1,800 sailors short. We're going to come up about 1,800 mariners short. And that's going to have a big implication. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is there's a lot being written about this. Next year, put it in the back of your heads, there's going to be an exercise called Defender 2020, where they're going to try for the first time since the Persian Gulf War, literally, to send a division of forces to Europe and to Asia. We used to do this during the Cold War, something called Reforger. Now they're going to try it with Defender. They're going to try to do it. Right now, we're rotating brigades in and out of Europe, where we're using commercial vessels and some reserve ships to send combat forces over for Eastern Europe deployments. But one of the big issues is whether or not we can do this with divisions. Can we do this with divisions? We did it during 2003, during the Iraq War, where we activated 40 ships. But that was 16 years ago, and the question is our Sealift capability still there? Because while we acknowledge the US Navy, you know, hey, it's the best Navy in the world, most capable navy in the world. We have the #1 Navy in the world, but we have the #22 Merchant Marine in the world. And that's one of the big issues. The size of our commercial fleet has diminished tremendously. When we got out of World War II, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Merchant Marine was tops, #1. The U.S. merchant fleet carried 63% of our trade. Today, we go from a high of the World War I. Today, we're down to about 180 ships. 180 ships, about 7 million gross tons of shipping. Understand, while this doesn't look that bad, well, wait a minute, this gross tonnage looks a little bit more, that looks better. We're more efficient with less. You have to understand, world trade has increased exponentially. In 1950, world trade, the amount of goods that shipped around the world, was about 500 million tons. About 500 million tons. Today, it's over 11 billion tons. It's over 11 billion tons. And it's increasing exponentially. There's a lot more traffic on the world, a lot bigger ships in the world today out there. They're doing a lot more with less. And unfortunately, our civilian commercial industry is declining. Why? There's many reasons why this happens. It's cheaper to register ships in overseas and foreign flags. U.S. costs are very expensive. It's expensive to pay for U.S. mariners, just like it's expensive to pay for U.S. sailors. We can replace you guys with Filipino sailors. I don't think you would enjoy that and everything, but that could be done. That's what happens on civilian ships. And so this has a big impact. But what impact does this have on our ability as a nation to engage in warfare? Does it matter whether or not my goods are shipped to me on a U.S. ship or a Panamanian flag ship? Well, if I'm going to a store to buy socks, do I really care? Probably not. Probably not. But if I'm counting on that ship to deliver military goods, the beans, the bullets, the black oil, do I really want to depend on ships that aren't U.S. flagged and are willing to go into areas? Those 180 ships represent a very small amount. At the time of the Persian Gulf War in 1990, this was 460 ships. At the time of Iraq 2003, this was about 250 ships. Now we're down to 180 ships. And understand, there's only a few things that keep this fleet together. There's only a few things that keep this fleet together. So for example, the ships in red here, there's a U.S. law that went into effect in 1920 called the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. It's referred to as the Jones Act. The Jones Act says if you're going to trade between U.S. ports, that ship has to be U.S. built, U.S. owned, U.S. flagged, U.S. crewed. So if you're going to move goods, for example, like Matson does, between the west coast of the United States and Hawaii, it has to be U.S. built, U.S. flagged, U.S. crewed, U.S. equipped. You'll see one ship not U.S. in that. That's the ship that goes to China for Matson, brings in gear from there. If you remove the Jones Act, which is a big push right now, you remove 100 ships from this. You remove 100 ships from this list. Oops, sorry. You move 100 ships. Sorry, the red ones are supposed to disappear. I'm not sure why I didn't do it on this one. The other aspect is the U.S. government pays 60 vessels in a program called the Maritime Security Program. Maritime Security Program ensures that U.S. ships remain under U.S. flag, and they provide us our ability to transport goods overseas. So for example, Mercogliano, which is the largest shipping firm in the world today, has a subsidiary that's an American firm. Maersk ships load on the east coast of the United States, they go to Europe, they go to the Middle East. If you're in the Middle East, you're in Bahrain, and you're a special operator, and you're expecting food and gear coming in to Bahrain, it's probably going to come on a Maersk ship. If you're in Korea, probably APL is going to be bringing it from the west coast. If you remove the Maritime Security Program, and again, those red ones there should be gone, sorry, I don't know why they're not, you're going to lose 60 ships. You're down to just 20 ships left in the fleet, just 20 ships left in the fleet. And so there are key things about maintaining the Merchant Marine. You remove these ships, not only do you remove your ability to sustain, but that surge Sealift fleet, those 61 ships I showed you before, draw their crews from these vessels. Those 29 Combat Logistics Force vessels, those 30 command and support vessels, those prepositioning ships I showed you, also draw their crews from here. And so, having a Navy that's number 1 in the world, but a merchant marine that's number 22 in the world isn't maybe the ideal situation to be in if you want to be the leading maritime power. I say that because China has the 2nd largest Navy in the world and the 2nd largest merchant marine in the world. And you have to ask yourself which one is the better of the two. I just want to leave you with this. There's a lot of discussion about this right now. There's a lot more talk about this across the board. I myself wrote an op-ed not too long ago in the Navy Times. GAO has been writing about this. There's been reports done by a myriad of agencies. The CSBA did one on sustaining the fight, talks about logistics. There's fights over the Jones Act, whether or not we should keep the Jones Act or repeal the Jones Act. American Maritime Partnership is a pro-Jones Act advocacy group, whereas the Cato Institute argues for the repeal of the Jones Act. And one of the things I want to highlight is this. The military needs to be aware of the commercial implications of the merchant marine. If you look at the cooperative strategy for 21st century, which is basically the handbook here for understanding how our military is going to go forward and operate, there is almost no mention of what I talked about here, of the merchant marine, of Sealift, of commercial applications. Matter of fact, if you turn to the inside cover of it, you'll see a huge picture of a Japanese container ship in there, not an American one, but a foreign flag one. And that has implications. If we want to execute a maritime strategy, if we want to execute proficiently in an operation akin to Operation Iraqi Freedom, or if we get into a peer-to-peer confrontation with China or Russia, are we going to be able to sustain a force capable like we did in World War I or World War II? Understand, the Navy has told the head of the Transportation Command and the Maritime Administration that in time of war, we don't have enough ships to provide escorts for your commercial vessels. So if you got to sail those prepositioning ships out of Diego Garcia and you got to go to Korea, you have to sail through the Malacca Straits, but more importantly, you got to sail past the Chinese holdings in the South China Sea. How do you get past those surface-to-surface missiles if China decides to stop you from making that transit? Because if you can't go through the South China Sea, you're talking about a transit of thousands of extra miles. Thousands of extra miles. And this is not a capability that you can replace overnight. The ship infrastructure, the ability to build vessels takes a long time. The ships, when you study World War II, and you look at ships like the Essex-class carriers, understand, if you look at Newport News Shipyard on September 1st, 1939, the SS America, commercial passenger liner, slid down the way. Slid down the way on September 1st, 1939, the day the Germans invade Poland. The hull number 1 of the Maritime Commission is built. On that same slipway, they will build USS Indiana, a battleship, USS Yorktown, and 3 other Essex-class carriers. They're going to build on that commercial infrastructure. They're going to build on that commercial infrastructure. There was a well-known historian by the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan who talked about sea power. And when he defined sea power, you look at sea power as being the application of military force at sea. Mahan says, no, it's commercial and military. But I'm going to write about the military because I'm a Navy captain. But that commercial is still important. It is still important. And so what I hope to do is convey to you all that role that the Merchant Marine plays, both in combat logistics force, with civilian crews on the auxiliaries, in the prepositioning role, the ability to get forces quickly to the battlefield, as we saw in both Iraq and in the first Persian Gulf War, the ability to surge forces from the United States as needed, and then the ability to sustain them today. Combat forces in Afghanistan today are receiving their supplies via container ships in the Maritime Security Program that are offloading in ports like Karachi, Riga, Vladivostok, and then shipping them overland. And that commercial infrastructure is extremely important to understanding how we wage warfare in the years ahead. I want to thank you guys for the opportunity, and if you have any questions at all, I'm happy to address them at this time. Thank you. Sir.
Thank you, Sal. This is probably the third iteration of this pitch that I've seen. So what gets me about your presentation is #1 Navy in the world, was you said 22nd?
22nd.
So that's what got me, which is why I voted for your essay for the C&O contest to actually win the thing. I placed you first.
Thank you,
So
I appreciate
this gets
that.
to my question. This gets to my actual question. I do have a question. My question, so the guy who won, I actually placed like 6th. It just didn't really gel well with me. It doesn't seem like the Navy, with all of this talk of near peer and preparation for fighting China and Russia and all this other kind of stuff, it doesn't seem like the Navy cares about any of this stuff. It really doesn't. Is it just because logistics is boring? And I don't mean to say that logistics is boring to insult anyone, but I mean, is it not as sexy as sea power and surface-to-surface fires? And why isn't anyone paying attention to this? Because it seems to me to be critically important. Even if you look at World War II, so much of that war at sea was about defending or establishing logistical supply lines, right?
Right.
So why aren't people talking about it?
Well, I think #1, you tend not to become an admiral riding on a tugboat. That doesn't quite happen. Now, I will argue that you read the quotes from all the senior admirals in World War II. They're going to talk to you about logistics, and one of the issues I think has been that we have done logistics extremely well. We make do with what we have. We've been able to achieve success. In my study on the Vietnam War, for example, when Westmoreland wants to do his big unit strategy, the logistics guys say you can't do it. It's just, you can't bring a first-class army into Vietnam. It's just you're not going to be able to bring 500,000 troops into Vietnam. And the logistics guys say, well, we'll make it work. We'll build ports. We'll come up with this new innovation called containerization, and we'll be able to bring a lot more cargo faster in, and we'll overcome it. The problem that we're getting to is we're going to be at the point when that logistics is not going to be able to be there. And that's the problem right now. We're used to it. Hey, my stuff is going to show up. I know it's going to show up. We've always been able to get it there. What I'm trying to raise the awareness is it may not be able to get there. When you have 20% of your surge Sealift fleet broken down because of the age of the vessels, because again, the average age of these vessels is 44 years old. 44 years old. The licensing to man some of these ships are steam powered. Steam power is being phased out in the commercial industry because of requirements. You're going to lose all your steam engineers because that's not a method that's going to be used because of pollution control. There's a thing called ISO 2020 that's going to reduce sulfur emissions. You're not going to be able to find the requisite number of mariners to man these vessels. And then you're going to have to realize that, well, we're going to have to do less with what we have. And I think it's starting to hit. I think everyone's starting to realize it. We're seeing a lot more. It's not just me writing about it. It's a batch of people writing about it and talking about it. But it needs to be done. It also impacts you as a Navy, because when shipbuilding costs go skyrocketing to build a Ford-class carrier, an LCS, one of the reasons is we're not building as many commercial ships. If you look at the 3 largest shipbuilders in the world, 90.5% of all shipping is done in 3 countries in the world: China, Korea, Japan. It's all in the Far East. How is it that China can pop out Type 55, Type 52 destroyers as fast as they can? Because they're building 30 to 50 commercial ships a year. And they're not the same. I'm not trying to argue that a Burke-class destroyer is the same as a container ship, but there are some fundamentals that are the same in building vessels. And when you're only building 2 or 3 ships a year versus 50 or 60, that impacts you. That impacts you. And again, one of the things I think the military has to do is acknowledge that this is an issue. For a long time, we'll assume the Merchant Marine will always be there. Well, they may not be there. At which case, are you sure that you're going to be able to use foreign shipping to get your supplies there? And I think that's the big concern that's looming on the horizon. And again, for you all, the upcoming in the Navy, that's something you need to be aware of as that comes in. Yes, sir.
So, in regard to that question, so the question was basically phrased, what is the Navy doing about this? The 2 ways I'm saying it is a Navy problem. Who are we addressing this problem to, though? Because the way to solve it, there's 2 ways. If the Navy's going to solve this problem, let's go back to World War I, and we man our own logistic ships. In the military, Sealift Command balloons up. That's probably not going to happen, right? So the Navy has a contained budget, so we can't just do this. So what we need help with is Congress, right? Because it's a merchant marine. The Navy doesn't own the merchant marine.
Right.
and we also need industry. So is this argument going out to Congress? I saw the Congressional Review Service and all that.
Right.
But it's also going out to industry, because it's bigger than just the Navy. We can post all this stuff in USNI, et cetera,
Yep.
and talk about it as Navy, but really the key, unless we can fix it, which we can't put on the budget, is we need industry and Congress to increase the merchant marines, kind of what I'm saying. Is that correct, or
Right.
is that argument
It is,
going out?
and let me be clear. My argument is not that the Navy needs to pay for this. This is not.
Right.
This is not what it is. I was trying to show the Navy involvement. The Navy has a vested interest, especially in the combat logistics force element, for a strong merchant marine. I think this has to be across the board. The DoD needs to sit there and say, listen, part of our aspect, and this is U.S. government policy, that we shall have a merchant marine. It's actually in the law. It actually states that. And it says that. But the problem is that DoD needs to recognize that. You know, the Army needs to recognize, hey, it's great to have 10 divisions of forces in CONUS. It's great to have 10 National Guard divisions. It's going to do you absolutely no good if you can't get them overseas, because there's not enough ships to do that. And again, you know, it's hard to trade off a combat force for that. So, for example, the 60 ships in the Maritime Security Program, that costs the government $5 million per ship. So that's $5 million times 60. It's $300 million a year. Is $300 million a year a good investment? I would argue it is, to have 60 ships to do that. You know, are you willing to trade off on $300 million a year? And I think that's the question that needs to start being raised. What does the military need in terms of logistics? What does it work? Because it does, you can see the interoperability. When you convert an Alaska-class tanker, for example, into an expeditionary support base, it helps to have a commercial resource available to do that. You know, we shouldn't have to buy, one of the big things that they're doing right now is recapitalizing the Sealift fleet. You know, I'm not a big advocate of buying ships just to lay them up in reserve. I don't think that's a good way. I'd much rather have active ships out there and tap into them, because that's ships working. It's also a presence. You like a U.S. flag out there doing things. And so I think one of the things is getting the leadership, and more importantly, even among you all, the knowledge that this is a problem. This is something we should be aware of, so that when issues do come up, it's like, okay, we need sustainment. Where are we going to get that sustainment from? You know, merchant marine in the Navy used to be like this. You know, John Paul Jones' first job was sailing commercial ships. You know, during the age of sail, Navy and merchant marine were like this, but when steam came, it kind of bifurcated. And one of the arguments I would argue is we kind of need to be a little closer together on that. So I think knowledge is one of the big things. But you're right, it's a government issue. Oh, 3 minutes left. Yes, ma'am.
So just a sort of clarifying question, the relationship between the military and the commercial missions, I guess, in the military Sealift command,
Sure.
doesn't really, I guess, make sense in regards to how, I guess, what training programs are implemented to convert a ship through the Maritime Security Program that is a civilian commercial shipping ship, but how do we know that their crews are ready to actually transition over to do military missions?
Well, the Maritime Security Program ships are out there sailing right now. So they're on commercial routes delivering cargo right now. So one of the things that they're doing is they're providing for their crews, the main, you know, mariners, unlike you all, are on their own to get their training. They basically, it's one of the reasons they get paid a little bit more, is because they have to go out, get training, keep certified, and when they get off a ship, they're off a ship. They're not getting paid anymore. They're off. And so one of the things you need is that pool of mariners to tap into. When they did the turbo activation I talked about a little while ago, one of the big tests was to see, are there mariners out there who we can tap into to come on these ships? And one of the things that we found out was, and it hasn't been officially released yet, but I'm pretty well in tune with this, is there were enough mariners to go out for 10 days, but there are not enough to go out for a 6-month deployment. And so one of the things that we have to do is increase that commercial fleet, because if we want those reserve ships, we need to pool from those fleets. Militarizing the military Sealift command, that's what they did in World War I, and they found out that not to be the solution, because later on when they needed personnel to go on destroyers and anti-submarine craft, they weren't available. And that became a big issue. So last question.
Could you comment on what supposedly the Iranians taking over a couple of oilers? Very, very easy, very inexpensive.
Yep.
How do we protect?
Yeah, one of the things that was done in World War I, World War II was referred to as armed guards, is putting on armed guards. Merchant mariners, by definition, cannot have weapons on board. You can't militarize a commercial vessel, because you won't be able to enter in and out of ports. during the East Africa, Somalia pirates, when they grabbed Tom Hanks. One of the things they talked about was putting on armed guards, these civilian armed guards. The problem is you had to take them off beforehand. During World War I, World War II, they put armed guard detachments, basically military crews. Literally in World War I, they pulled them off battleships and brought their guns and put them on. That's exactly what the Royal Navy does with the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. I think that's a simple way to do it. When they grabbed the Iranians, grabbed those ships, you can convoy, but convoy is a very difficult thing to do. The traffic in and out of the Persian Gulf is too big. It's much easier to slap a couple of military personnel on board, let them run through, fire the warning shots, and defer them than anything else. We're up against time. I know some of you guys got to go. I appreciate everybody coming out. I hope you got something out of today. Thank you very much.